women as individuals, men and women as groups, men and women as two halves of one species, love, sex, envy, hate, fairness, unfairness, confusion, fear, anger, appreciation, resentment. If everything is relative, what can be more relative than relations between the sexes? Every week, your host, Jack Kammer, talks with a man or a woman on the podcasts Men Are Talking or Goodwill Toward Men, and aims to deliver at least one idea that will make you think, wow, I never thought of it like that. Today, Jack talks with a man on Men Are Talking.
Today on Men Are Talking, we talk with Rick Belden, a poet, author, and artist. He's also a coach who specializes in helping men understand and heal from abuse, a process he knows and feels deeply from the inside out. To me, what Rick is mostly is a man with a lot of wisdom, strength, and integrity. Take a listen. See if he has anything you might want to think about in your own effort to maximize your own ability to feel good about yourself. Hello, Rick Belden.
Hey, Jack. It's good to see you.
Good to see you. It's really good to see you. I've seen you quite a bit recently in the videos that I've watched in preparation for this episode of Men Are Talking. But it's even better to have a chance to talk with you directly.
Yeah.
So not only do I get to see you, I get to talk with you.
I appreciate that too, because over the years we've corresponded a lot at various times. Yeah. And you've been real helpful to me, especially in my earliest stages of kind of moving my work out into public. So I always appreciated that. And after all this time, it's great to have a conversation in real time.
Yeah. Yeah. And you've been very helpful to me. I loved the book. Is it Iron Man Family Outing, I believe?
Correct, yes.
Read that and loved it. And your blog posts on Huffington Post have been fabulous. And you got a lot of great videos out there with other folks who have had the good fortune to be able to interview you. So I would like to begin our interview by telling the audience about your educational credentials.
Okay.
And so I am going to do that. I'm going to start that by saying Rick Belden earned his PhD in a self-study course at the School of Hard Knocks. Mm-hmm. Fair enough?
That's a fair and very efficient assessment, yes.
All right, very good. So I'm sure we will circle back to the hard knocks, mm-hmm. and your own personal struggles and your determination to learn and figure out what was going on and how to make it better. Mm-hmm. But for right now, I would like to just talk about a couple of sort of basic issues, and then we'll get into some of the. If you're not. I imagine you're probably not tired of talking about your own struggles. So we'll get to that. Mm-hmm. Fair enough? Yeah. Okay. Good.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Your own struggles are in some ways unique to you, but they're in other ways very typical of what a lot of men have to deal with. Mm-hmm. Okay. Very good. All right. Well, just for basics, we're going to talk today about emotions and feelings. Okay. And I wonder is there a difference between the two ideas?
Well, that's an interesting question. A lot of the time when I talk, well, even in my work with myself and how I think about that subject with myself, when I'm working with other men, I like to characterize emotions in terms of emotional energy. That seems to help men sort of divorce themselves from the idea that there's something feminine about it. It's like, so I start talking about energy that sort of has a different connotation. And in some ways, I think it's easier for men to connect with physically. I think it's easier for men to visualize. When you talk about energy, you think about, a lightning bolt or, a flood or something like that. And so I guess that's the way I kind of approach the emotion side. The feelings side to me is almost in some ways more about imagination. It's more metaphorical. It's more general. It's more vague in some way, and more. There are a lot more adjectives, I guess, associated with that in the way that I look at it. So I don't know if that's a sensible distinction or not, but that's the kind of nuance, I guess, that I see between those two things.
Okay, good. And I wanted to talk with you about the idea that that this whole topic, this whole field, in the minds of some men and in mine, has a tinge, a connotation of femininity, talking about feelings. Do you find that emotions has less of that tinge than the word feelings?
I would say so, yes. And again, talking about energy, talking about emotional energy, to me, it moves it even a step further away from all that.
So your standard term is emotional energy, then? That's what you offer to.
I tend to default to that, yeah, because it feels just, even to me, it feels there's something. It seems like it neutralizes some of the stigma. Somehow.
Yes. Well, the best way to keep a man away from something is to paint it pink.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Or even just to shine a pink light on it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Or even just to put one pink ribbon on it.
Right.
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 So, okay, well, good. I'm glad you've got emotional energy and that's working for you. I have some other ideas that I'd like to kick around with you.
Sure.
Because probably it might be fair to say, it might even be largely accurate to say that many of the men who can most benefit from the kind of work that you can help them do are the men who are most avoidant of pinkness.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So if we can come up with some other words, emotional energy is good, but I want to run a couple others by you, because if we can provide some words that some men might be able to really identify with and help them think, well, that's not pink. I could talk about this. Then it would do some good, right?
Sure.
So what would you think of talking about, instead of feelings or emotions? In your case, you'd like to talk about emotional energy. I'm going to run through a bunch of these. Some of them aren't good, but just for the purpose of brainstorming, what would you think of inviting men to talk about their impulses?
That seems like a fair way to approach it.
Okay. How about asking them to talk about their momentum?
That also seems pretty non-threatening, and it's action oriented. It's movement, action. That sort
energy.
Right.
Energy.
Right.
Inviting men to talk about their motivations. That's
something that's pretty central to the way that I approach my work with people. Yeah.
Okay. And in thinking about sports and teams, the idea of morale is really important.
True. Yeah. Or any kind of organization, any kind of group.
How about asking men to come and talk with you about their drives, or drive, singular? I don't really like to make what's going on with men mechanical, but we do have to sort of meet men where they are.
Right.
And a lot of men sort of think in terms of machines, because we like machines and we like gadgets. And in a book that I wrote, I referred to our emotions and our feelings as the spark plugs of our personalities.
Right.
And you don't want to let them get disconnected. And you don't want to let them get gunked up, get fouled up with a lot of deposits in crud.
Right.
You got to blow them out every once in a while. And then, of course, there are the ideas of emotional intelligence. So if you don't want to talk about your feelings or your emotions, talk about your emotional intelligence, because that could help you feel like, yeah, you're being really intelligent by doing this work. How about emotional fitness?
That's a good one. Yeah.
And then the last one I had on my list brings up that word energy. I had emotional energy.
Oh, you did. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So if anybody in this audience is thinking, yeah, I'm really not that happy, and I guess happiness is an emotion, maybe it would be okay for me to think about my emotions, because I'm going to think of them in terms of emotional fitness instead,
Right.
making it less of a barrier to come and talk with you. Okay, good. All right. Why have you found in your own life and in the lives of the men you have worked with, why is it important to be cognizant, to be aware of, to be fit, to be smart about your emotions, your emotional energy?
Well, I think of a couple of things right off the top, and I guess maybe the primary thing that I like to work on with everybody is, let's talk about your relationship with yourself. Because if you have a poor relationship with yourself, then you're going to have a difficult life. And so for me, that's one of the reasons why emotional energy, however you want to, terminology you want to use, is important, because it's a primary fundamental component in the dynamic that's represented in the relationship that you have with yourself. And how you feel about yourself is a big component of what your life is, how you experience life. And so if you have difficult sort of emotional states that might be lingering from something in the past, or even something that's happened today, and you don't really have an effective way to relate to that, that's going to impinge upon the quality of the relationship that you have with yourself, which is going to make your life quality less than it could be. And it's also going to impact your effectiveness, whether it's in your relationships, or whether it's with how you take care of your health, or whether it's in your work or your life goals, or your ability to just enjoy yourself. I mean, there's just a whole lot of different areas of life that can either be, you can benefit down or benefit up, depending upon how well you're able to manage and connect with your emotional energy under different circumstances and situations, and understand what it represents. One of the things I like to talk about with people is, think of it as information. Okay. If you can sort of extract out the intensity of the emotional energy of the feeling, what is the information that's there that it's giving you? Because you need it. That's why it's in your face.
A little bit like pain in the body, it's trying to tell you about a problem.
Yeah, and if it's bad enough, it's telling you about a problem that you haven't been paying attention to, or you didn't know what to do about it. Sometimes I think people get kind of a bad rap. It's something kind of builds up to critical mass, and there might be this attitude of well, if you'd taken care of that 5 years ago. And sometimes it really is because people procrastinate, or they're lazy, or they don't want to. But a lot of the time it's because you don't have enough information that's coalesced in a format where you can actually see the thing.
Give me an example of a critical piece of information that you have helped men uncover and embrace and understand.
Well, for example, I work with clients, male clients, that come out of difficult relationships with women, and they don't understand the dynamic. And I'll talk with them about things like borderline personality disorder. So I'm not a clinician. I can't diagnose that, but I'm aware of what that experience is like. And so a man who has had that experience, or is in that experience, and he doesn't have that information, can't make sense of it. Whereas if he has that information as an external reference point, he can look at it and evaluate it and go, yeah, this pattern seems to fit. And then he has he can make an informed strategic decision about either how he relates to the information that came out of that experience for him, if it's over, or what do I do about this thing that I'm in?
So in this example, we're talking about a man who was in a relationship with a woman who was diagnosable, who was in the throes of borderline personality disorder.
Right. And again, yeah. So like for me, I don't, because I can't diagnose things, but I can point people to literature where they can learn about that condition, and they don't have to diagnose it either. It's just additional context that, for example, might help the guy understand. It's like, well, this is why the strategy I've been taking with this person keeps failing, because she has a limitation. And so if I'm going to stay in this situation, I need to like get real about what her limitation is and learn about what are some different ways to approach that. And if the relationship's over, it gives the guy the opportunity to go, well, it wasn't all just me, like screwing up and not being enough and not knowing what to do. It's like, this is a real challenge for anybody. And so then they can actually put their part in the failure of the relationship into some kind of like reasonable, meaningful perspective. Because, a lot of guys that I work with, and it's been true for me, come out of a relationship failure just going, what did I do wrong? What did I not do enough of? How could this have been avoided? And I think a lot of the time, in order for anybody, men or women, to heal and recover and sort of benefit from the experience they had in a relationship, is to understand the limits of what they were actually able to do.
So in the absence of information about what happened, is it the case, almost the default for men, many men, most men, is the default thinking, must have been my fault. What did I do?
It's the default for a lot of men. And I think that, we always have to look back at root causes, basically, how did I get like this? How did I develop a belief system? How did I develop a set of narratives that tells me if something fails, it's my fault and I did everything wrong? Where's that come from?
And on the other hand, the other extreme, no doubt you have run into men who have said the exact opposite. I didn't do anything. It's all her fault. Yeah?
I haven't had a lot of men like that, actually.
Really?
But I've had some. Okay. And that's a different sort of challenge.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. So the bulk of the men you're dealing with are sort of like defaulting to the male principle of being responsible and accountable, and trying to think about a sense of honor. How did I contribute to this?
Right.
In what way did I screw up?
Right.
That's really interesting.
And I get a lot of, I talk a lot with, because this is something I've learned about myself, I talk a lot with clients about overfunctioning. Overfunctioning that's one of the artifacts of the childhood I had, which is that I need to make superhuman effort with everything in order to justify my existence, in order to have a chance that somebody might actually want to be around me, all that stuff. Well, where does it come from? Well, a lot of the men that work with me are working on mother wound issues. And so they grew up as children in a situation where they were either caretaking the mother, they felt responsible for her emotions, they felt responsible for her as an adult, even as children. And so that's the sort of bias that these guys carry into adulthood with them. And so if they're in a relationship with a woman and it fails, then they're going to revert back to that narrative and that role that was given to them and they built around themselves as a little boy, which is like, if mommy's unhappy, then I did something wrong. I'm not doing enough. What do I need to do to for her to be okay, or for her to approve of me.
So we'll get a little deeper into the concept of the mother wound in a few minutes when we get to your PhD and your self-study course.
Okay.
Do you find in working with men, or maybe even not just working with men, but just observing men generally, that I've heard it said, I want your commentary on this, that men don't pay attention to feelings because they think feelings aren't important. And the reason they think feelings aren't important is because they learned that their feelings weren't important. Nobody paid attention to their feelings, so I guess feelings aren't important.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not gonna devote much attention to those. Do you see that much?
I think that's a big part of it. Yeah. And so then the question is, like, how did these guys learn that their feelings aren't important? And that, I think there are multiple sources for that. That can be in the family, in terms of, as a boy, so for example, for me, if I was crying, it didn't matter which parent it was. What I heard was, if you don't stop crying, I'm going to give you something to cry for. Well,
Yeah.
okay, I'm not going to do that anymore. That's a bad result. But then that gets reinforced in school as well. It's reinforced on the playground, reinforced with teachers, with coaches, socially. And then as an adult, I had experiences with women I was involved with where if I started to cry, it's like, if you don't stop, I'm leaving. So, so that's, and then the other sort of thing, so that's sort of the direct experience model. The other sort of model that I would think of is, you look at your father, you look at your uncles, you look at your grandfather, you look at your coaches, like the other sort of male elders around you as a child, and you look at how they handle and express their emotions. So for me, I had a very angry father. So guess what? As an adult, I was comfortable with that. Now, he directed it at me and other people. I didn't direct it at other people. I directed it inward at myself, or outward against alarm clocks and plates and things like that. But if I saw my father cry, which I didn't until I was much older, that was very scary, because I hadn't seen that before. So there's that sort of direct experience influence, and then there's the indirect experience of observing the older males around you and seeing, well, how do they do it? And the other thing about my father is he could never really express happiness either. So I became very reserved about that after a certain point. Mm-hmm. It felt vulnerable to me. And so that's another sort of piece of this. When you talk about men's feelings, a lot of people just presume that you're talking about sadness, grief, crying, but a lot of men are very tight around even expressing joy or happiness.
Any idea why?
A couple thoughts. One is someone in my case, where if you had a father who was just always scowling, didn't appear happy no matter what was going on. Well, it's like, okay, I guess it's not conscious, but you just model that and go, okay, that's how a male behaves. But I also think that when you lock down so much of your emotional energy, it's not as surgical as people might think. So if you're locking down a bunch of grief, you're probably locking down a bunch of joy too. Those access points just aren't very open, or they're very narrow. And for me, I'd have to kind of do some forensic backtracking. But again, somewhere along the line, I developed the idea that I would be making myself vulnerable if I appeared to be too happy, or if I appeared to be too joyful. And I think that's what drives a lot of adult male behavior, is there's this sort of unconscious decision branch that you're running all the time. Is this going to make me more vulnerable? Is this going to make me more vulnerable? And it's yes, I'm not doing that. And so Those are some of the thoughts I have on that.
That might be a good segue to this next little item I wanted to run past you. I used to do a little stand-up comedy, and one of my little bits was, what do you think of this whole idea that men should be more sensitive? Personally, I think it's crazy. If suddenly men became more sensitive, but nothing else changed in our lives, all we'd feel is more pain.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so perhaps men are thinking, why do I want to come and talk to this Belden guy who's going to make me more open when the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune are still out there coming my way?
Right. Fair point. Really fair point. Smart thinking, actually.
So what's required then is for you to offer some sense of maybe not immediate protection, but this will make you less vulnerable, even if the world doesn't change its approach to you.
Mm-hmm.
How do you convince them that this is going to make them less vulnerable? I mean, the idea is that, man, I got to be strong, but really what they're afraid of is, man, I'm weak. I'm so vulnerable. I'm so exposed here.
Mm-hmm.
How do you convince them that, the work is worth doing because they're going to be stronger and more able to fend off the things that want to hurt them?
Well, a couple of points. Again, I always go back to, let's work on your relationship with yourself, because the stronger your relationship is with yourself, the more you actually allow of yourself into your relationship with yourself, the less vulnerable you are to harm, emotional and psychological harm from the outside, because you've got your inner reserves. You know who you are. You understand that you can be more robust in your interactions with the outside world. The other thing I work on a lot with guys is boundaries. So many men they're trapped in a binary when it comes to boundaries. It's like they either have like almost none, or their boundaries are like impregnable, like nobody can get near them, and they oscillate back and forth. Sometimes they'll do that in their relationships. They'll do that in their marriages, and so that's not, if you think about it from like a wargaming mindset or whatever, that's not effective, right? So what I want to help men do is look at the state of your boundaries. How do you express them? How do you maintain them? How do you keep them consistently and all that kind of stuff? And so that's necessary if you're going to experience yourself at whatever level of sensitivity that you have that's natural for you. And if you're going to allow some of that out in the world, you're going to get slaughtered if you go out there with no boundaries. And if you just keep yourself locked in concrete, then nothing can get out. So that's something I work with men, in that area. Is like, first of all, let's do a state assessment. What are your boundaries like right now? And again, a lot of guys are great at work. If they're at work and they're managing a team and somebody from another team comes in and says, I need you to do this, they'll say, wait a minute, okay, is that within my scope of responsibility? Is my team maxed out already? What's the deadline? Who are you? But at home, they'll just, like, whatever somebody comes at them with, like with their mom or their wife or whatever, it's like, oh, God, I don't really want to do that, but okay, And so these boundaries, it's not just like the boundaries are in a fixed state in every situation. And so one of the things I like to try to do with guys is like, look, can you start to bring some of your work strategy around boundaries into your personal life? Because you know how to do it over here, so it's not foreign to you. And if it feels weird or you're not sure that you want to do it over here, let's talk about what's different.
So let's talk about what's different real quick. You mentioned, 42 and a half seconds ago, the example of going home and you might have a problem with your wife or your mother.
Mm-hmm.
is what's different, that there is, I know there are women at work, but it's a work environment. Is the difference at home that it is a domain of women, and that the rules are different there, and it's ruled by feminine principles, and so the man feels, oh my God, my job here is to make the woman happy. If mom ain't happy, ain't nobody happy.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the big difference?
I think that's part of it. So I think it's easy. I think it's easier to be objective in a work environment because the standards by which you're measured, at least allegedly, they're easier to understand and they're more consistent. So like you got deadlines, you got tasks, you got reports, all that kind of stuff. You understand what the consequences are. And also there's always the idea of in work that you can just like, well, if this gets bad enough, I'll just go somewhere else. And it's a lot easier. People get invested, someone works at somewhere 25 years, it's, they're pretty invested, but there's always some sort of exit that's available to you. Whereas at home, the prospect of exiting is a much more intimidating, much more complicated pathway. And so there's almost like, it's almost like you're trapped in some ways, or you can feel that way. And the other thing I think is more likely to happen at home, and it can happen in the workplace too, especially with, the opposite sex or managers or whatever, but it's so easy to age regress when you're at home. So if a man has had a problematic experience with his mother growing up, and he's dealing with his wife, and she sort of replicates a pressure situation that he felt as a child with his mother about getting things done or expectations, he can easily just age regress. And all of a sudden, 45-year-old guy that, he deals with clients all day long or whatever, effectively, he's a 7-year-old boy who's dealing with someone that he sees as an adult and a parent and like more powerful than he is, who kind of holds his life in his hands. And so he doesn't feel like he's got a lot of options.
Even just saying, I'm getting out of here for an hour, I'll be back in an hour, can cause a problem. Where are you going? You're walking away from me. He is, in a way, often very trapped. And
in a situation like that, I encourage the man to like go for that problem. Go for the problem where you go out for an hour because you need to collect yourself or you need time for yourself or whatever, and deal with the consequences of that rather than deal with the consequences of just caving in, which is not good for you. It's not good for your relationship or your marriage. It's not good for her either. But it's not very palatable because it's always, how it's just human nature. Like, do I want to feel, this amount of pain in the moment, or do I want to deal with like a lot more pain down the road? Well, I'll take the pain down the road because I don't want to deal with this right now. I'll just kick that can.
Yeah. Bad decision.
I know, and it's not easy for guys. And I've also been terrible at it myself.
Yeah. Oh, I have. Yeah, I have too. I can cop to that. Less lately, I think, but yes, certainly I have fallen prey to that. Another basic.
Really, I just got one thing too, Jack, is like, you can't really blame anybody for going for what they want, right? So I think that's a mistake a lot of men fall into, kind of a trap too, is like, well, she shouldn't be like that, or she shouldn't expect that of me. And I'm guilty of this too. And what I'm starting to understand is like, it's not like you're in an adversarial relationship exactly, but people are going to press for what they think they can have. They're going to press for what they want. They're going to press for what they need. It's not up to the other person to realize what your boundary is and just not do that. It's like, it's up to you to let them know, this is my boundary. Yes, I can do that later, but not right now. I mean, and that's a lot of what men in these situations and other situations in their lives, they don't realize they have options. They think they only have two options. It's like either say yes and cave in, or say no, and then there's going to be some kind of hellstorm. It's like, well, there's other options in between there. Like, you can negotiate. You can gather more information. You can kind of do a little interview and go, how important, tell me how important this is to you. Tell me why this, it's like you can kind of like flesh the situation out and explore it and actually have a conversation about it. You can't do that with everybody, and you can't do that with everybody in every situation. But I feel like a lot of the time guys get jammed up because they feel like there's only, I either have to comply or we're going to have a big fight. So if I say no, I'm ready to fight. It's just like, well, maybe there's some space in between there that you can explore that would actually help the two of you function better together.
So if I'm your client, suddenly what you've done for me is help me feel more confident.
Mm-hmm. Good.
Yeah. I have options.
Right.
It's not kill or be killed. I don't want to kill her, but I don't want to be killed.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Another basic issue. What is the most, I use this phrase advisedly. What is the most masculine emotion? Okay. Well, I was hoping you would say anger.
Well, I was stalling.
Masculine. Go ahead.
I was stalling for time while I was thinking. That is, I think, anger would be the answer that would come to most people's minds.
And I use the word masculine in quotes.
Right.
Right. Okay.
I think it's, I think typically it's the easiest one for men to access and express with full intensity. We talked about that earlier. You might, it's not that you can't smile. It's just that like, you're not going to really show, like, you're not going to beam with joy when you're happy. But when it comes to anger, it's like, yeah, if you get into your angry place, people will see it, and it will rise up and it will sort of radiate out in fullness. Whereas other things, like if you're sad, people might just go, well, he looks kind of down today. But it's not going to be like really, really like profoundly evident.
Do you talk with your clients about the idea that anger is often a secondary emotion?
Mm-hmm.
Could you explain that?
Well, I can refer back to my own situation as well as others, which is that I find grief, deeply feeling and expressing grief is extremely difficult for me, extremely difficult. And so when I first got into men's work a long time ago, back when I was 28 or something, the first thing that I could access in terms of feeling and emotion and emotional energy was anger. And I had a lot of it. And I did a lot of anger, healthy anger expressive work, all that kind of stuff. And it was great. But I reached a certain point where I just was like, I'm still angry, but I don't really know what to attach this to. And what I found over time was that there was grief that the anger was protecting. So I think for a lot of us, a lot of men, anger serves a protective function to keep that vulnerable, raw, injured part safe, because there's a feeling or there's a knowledge or there's an experience that if anything comes out, anger is acceptable. But other things are not so acceptable. Nobody's going to challenge my masculinity if I'm being angry. But if I'm crying or if I'm asking for help, then those are potential challenge points in terms of how I see myself as a man, how other people perceive me. Potentially, I might be judged. If you're just angry, if people say, well, that guy's just an a-hole, they're not going to say, well, that guy's not very masculine. And it's like this whole masculine feminine thing is such quicksand at this point, because supposedly we're past it. But like, we can't get past it. And sometimes it's really illuminating. So like I spent several years studying tarot and that's symbology and all those archetypes that represents. And it's an old system. So you've got masculine symbology and you've got feminine symbology. And I think it's relevant. I think it matters. I think it's important. I think it's real. I think it's useful. But just like anything else, you can get bound up in that language and you can get bound up in those sort of concepts and definitions, and then you can limit yourself and you can limit other people. So what's the balance? I think that's part of what we're in the process as a culture of trying to discover and trying to understand. When is it useful to employ these concepts, and when is it actually hurtful or limiting to employ these concepts? And I'm still trying to work that out myself.
Yeah. Those strict, bright lines between masculine and feminine and male and female were much more necessary back in the day when we were a primitive tribe trying to maximize every bit of efficiency we could out of what men and women could do, maybe a little better than the other. Mm-hmm. So you're going to go to that room and you're going to go to that room, and we're still living in those rooms to a certain extent. We need a much more communal space.
And the other thing I have to add to this is that I still think that even though I got about three things going at once, I'll just try to stick with one. There's a lot of cultural, it started out as encouragement. I feel like now it's a lot of pressure on men to be vulnerable, to show their soft side, to show their sensitive side. And I think it's kind of oppressive in a lot of ways now, because first of all, not all men are put together the same way. I meet the criteria for a highly sensitive person. About 1 in 5 people, men and women, are highly sensitive. So the other 4 out of 5 men, they don't have that sort of innate experience with sensitivity that I have. So you shouldn't expect all 5 of us, to access that and present that and express it in the same way. And so one of the traps I think that we're in now is that there is an expectation of men in relationships with women that they're going to be more vulnerable, that they're going to be more open, they're going to be more expressive. But a lot of women aren't used to that. So they think they want to see that. And then when they do, they don't really know what to do with it. It's kind of scary. It's kind of off-putting. It challenges preconceptions that they didn't know that they had about what a man is supposed to be like and how he's supposed to behave. And they don't have the experience, like I said, with, modeling with my father. Well, what kind of modeling do these women have with their fathers? Did they see this from their fathers? Did they have fathers who were sort of like high functioning emotionally as well as high functioning as a man? And so I think that it presents a difficult situation for men and women in relationships, because the man feels pressure, like I'm just not doing enough, I'm not showing enough, I need to open up more. And if he stumbles into it or he does it on purpose, the woman is like, I'm not really sure what to make of this. This is a really different experience than what I'm used to. And maybe I don't like this. Maybe I actually liked it when he was more closed up, because this feels weird.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We talked about, before we went on the air, we talked about how long we thought this would go. But we also said, if it's going good, we're going to keep running with it. We're overtime, but we're going to keep going, okay? Especially since we have promised the audience earlier that we were going to talk about father wounds and mother wounds. Mm-hmm. Before we go to that, just to wrap up on the question of anger. Anger can be a healthy emotion.
Yes.
Anger can be a very unhealthy emotion, mm-hmm. especially if you're not clear on what it is that's making you angry. So you mentioned that anger can be an emotion secondary to grief. Mm-hmm. Anger can be an emotion secondary to sadness. Mm-hmm. Anger can be an emotion secondary to fear.
Yes.
And are there any other emotions that we might suggest men might think about when they're feeling angry, to see if they could maybe put the anger aside and get to what the business really needs to be?
I'm going to answer you, but I'm going to answer a different question, but it's in the same context.
You're my guest. Feel free.
Right. So, like, what causes anger to linger and not have no apparent resolution? Well, one of the things I talk with clients about is I have this idea that there are basically two sources of anger that you can experience. One is legacy anger, stuff that happened when you were a kid, stuff that happened earlier in your life, that divorce when you were 25, all that kind of stuff, where you've got unprocessed emotions, all the ones that you stated, as well as the frustration and the anger and the disappointment and the feelings of betrayal and all that kind of stuff. And you just haven't got to it yet. And so you can work your way through that so that you don't have that full bucket of that. The other one is the anger that you're accumulating on a daily basis because your boundaries suck. And so you can empty the legacy bucket, but if you are being provoked into feeling anger because your boundaries are terrible, because in my case, I'm learning, I have these covert contracts with people where I have my idea of, like, in this relationship, I do these things and you do these things. And they don't even know that. So I do all these things and they don't do these things. I was like, what the hell happened? And so that's an example of filling your anger bucket on a regular basis because you have expectations that are not clear to both people, or usually these go together, and your boundaries are terrible. So you're constantly saying yes when you want to say no. You feel like you're getting run over all the time. And so I think it's important to look at, if you have some anger that you want to clear out, I think it's important to look at it and try to characterize it and go, is this legacy, or is this because I keep doing this thing every day that makes me unhappy with people and I'm angry about it, but it's because of decisions and actions that are mine?
Very good. Thank you. So we have promised the audience that we will talk about father wounds and mother wounds. Mm-hmm. In your self-study course at the School of Hard Knocks, you learned about the father wound before you learned about the mother wound.
I did.
Could you take us from where you started before you knew about a father wound, understanding your father wound, not understanding the mother wound, but then eventually coming to understand the mother wound? What is a father wound? What is a mother wound? What are these wounds? And how did you get your PhD?
Well, just sort of informally, when I talk about a father wound or a mother wound, it is essentially a psychic wound that was incurred or experienced with one of those two parents around the very fundamental nature of the relationship. So as a child, there are certain things that you need from your father. There are certain things you need from your mother. Depending on if you're a boy or a girl, there's some variations in those things. And just as a child in general, there are certain things you need from your parents. And so if you don't get those things, then there are developmental stages that you cannot pass through. And so I've been talking more and more in terms of not just healing wounds, but actually completing developmental stages. And so in my case, what I talk about is a father wound, that kind of deep psychic wound that occurs because there's some sort of dysfunction or trauma or rift or neglect or abuse or absence in a relationship with a father. My father was present, but he was very angry. He's very hostile toward me, very threatening, very rejecting. So a big part of my father wound is, no matter what I do, I can't get this guy's approval. I can't get him to like me. I feel like he hates me. I feel like he doesn't want me here. So like really profound rejection, coupled with really profound hostility, and some physical abuse. So that set me up going out into the world with a deficiency around needs, basic needs that I had that were never met, that would never be met. And I wanted them met. And so I was angry about that. I was very sad about that, although I didn't realize it. And it also formed the model of what a man is like for me, both in positive and negative ways. So my father, like, he worked in a factory. He worked really hard. Work was like a sacred sort of thing for him. And so I picked that up too. And that has pluses and minuses. But I also saw that my father was the bad guy in the house, encouraged by my mother. He was a bad guy, but she played it up to make herself look better. And so in every relationship that I was in as a young adult, I didn't want to be the bad guy. It's like I'd do anything to not be the bad guy, because I promised myself when I was a kid, I'm not going to be like him. And yet in other ways, I had anger issues. As I said earlier, I didn't take them out on other people. I took them out on myself. One of the kind of mantras that my mom used to tell me about my father all the time, when he would mistreat me and I would talk with her about it when I was a kid, she would explain to me, this is why he's like this. He had a difficult childhood. And she would tell me, nobody's harder on your father than he is on himself. And so I internalized that. And so that was one of my basic tenets of being an adult male, is I must be harder on myself than I am on anybody else. So those are some examples of how that actually played out into my adult life.
Okay, so you mentioned in one of the videos that I watched recently that the father wound is easier to see. It's not as scary.
Mm-hmm.
That it's sort of more obvious and more, I don't know. The father's behavior is sort of undeniable.
Mm-hmm.
So next you get to the mother wound. You said in this video that I'm mentioning that the father wound didn't scare you. The mother wound terrified you.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain how you got over your terror to address the mother wound?
Well, so I think there's a couple things going on there, and this isn't the same for everybody. Some people have really overtly narcissistic mothers who are just nasty, and they've known ever since they were a kid that there's a problem here. My mother, although again, I don't diagnose people, I just look at behavior and draw conclusions. My mother's behavior was narcissistic in a more, not an overt way, but a covert way. So I had the kind of mom where like all my friends just loved her. It's just like, oh, your mom must be great. And I thought she was too. And some ways she was, she's a whole human being. She's not a cartoon character. But a couple of things went on with me. Number one, because my father was so terrible, I needed to have at least one parent that I felt like was my friend. And my mother was happy to take that role and to amplify it as much as she could for her own purposes. And I felt loyal to her because I felt like, well, I know my father mistreats her, so I have to be on her side. I have to try to take care of her. I have to look out for her. I have to, when I was in college, I was thinking, boy, when I get out of college, I'm going to send her to college. And, just all this real like hardcore parentification type dynamics that I didn't know were going on. And sounds weird now when I say it, but that's where I was. I was like, and also just as a culture, I think there's a really strong taboo against sons challenging the quality of the mothering that they received. People just, and I've had some pretty hard pushback when I've talked about this from people at times. And I guess I sort of knew that. I guess I kind of knew that was coming. So in terms of your question, I think there were a couple aspects of it. Again, we're now, I'm 63, but there's a 5-year-old, there's an 8-year-old, there's a 10-year-old, there's a 12-year-old. They're all in there, and they're all in different situations. They have a lot of power sometimes. And so for me, I think I was worried about the sort of external criticism of this, and also inside the family. But I think the more profound terror that I felt was, number one, I'd already resolved inside that I really only kind of had one parent that was good. And if I got problems with my mom, then I don't have any good parents that were good. And also that very young part of myself that had bonded with her was absolutely committed to, we got to get this right. We got to get this, because we can't survive without her. And so that part of me had a lot of power in that situation. And that was one of the things that I had to deal with. But what really sort of broke down the terror and the resistance was just years and years of unhappy experiences with her, like profoundly unhappy, that I came to understand. It's like, she doesn't see me. She doesn't see who I am. She's only interested in, like this much of me. And that was like a surprise to me and it was a surprise that was kind of unfolded in slow motion, where I gradually realized it's like, wow, I have to cut out a whole lot of who I am in order to have a conversation with her. And even after that, then I'm like angry for 2 days. So this goes back to what we were talking about before. It's like, that wasn't legacy anger. That was the anger of continuing to like bend myself out of shape so that I could have a conversation with this person that still made me unhappy. And so finally, basically the unhappiness passed, got higher than the terror. And then I just piece by piece started to approach it.
So there are lots of little boys in you at different ages and different stages of development. You just described a process that one of those ages, one of those little boys was going through. You also mentioned in one of your videos that there was something that happened very, suddenly, sort of like a light bulb going off when you had an epiphany about your mother. Do you remember what I'm referring to? The key insight that you had about you and your mother.
So that there was a process that took place over about 4 months back in whenever it was, like the end of 2015, beginning of 2016, I think. And I ran across, there used to be a really good website called narcissisticmother.com. And I've been learning about narcissism, and I've been thinking, it's like, I think she's got some of these characteristics. And there's a self-test on the site. And by the way, the woman, the therapist that ran the site retired, and the site isn't there anymore, which is a shame. But it had a good self-test on it to determine, like, if you proceed from the assumption that your mother's narcissistic, take this test and find out, like, how much is this affecting you in your life right now? And it was scored, there were scores, and then there were levels. It was like red, orange, yellow, green, something like that. And I took it, I was way up in the red. It's just like, oh man, what? I've been doing all this work for the last 25 years and I'm still this far in the red on this test. And then I started to explore her site, and one of the first posts I looked at just started off with a sentence. So now that you've accepted that your mother is a narcissist, and I just busted out crying. I mean, it just was like completely, talk about all the filters and all the guards and everything just being just flattening, and everything just comes up. And that was the beginning of about a 4-month period of really, really intense grieving, like the most intense grieving I've ever done in my life about anything. And so somewhere in maybe the 3rd month or something like that, I was reading some material, and I went out and took a walk. And I remember it, like I know exactly where I was on the path. All of a sudden, I had this knowledge that I'm a separate person from her. We're separate people. And it wasn't just like a intellectual insight. It was like, tip to toe, like physical, intellectual, emotional, psychological, spiritual, soul understanding of like, we're not the same person. We're separate people. And I didn't cry that time. I was just like, wow, how did I not know that? But I didn't. And that's what made the change for me going forward. So that because about 9 months after that, she was diagnosed with a terminal health condition that played out over the next couple of years. And I hadn't been in contact with her for a couple of years because I had cut back my contact with her little by little because it was just so bad for me. And then I had to think when she got her diagnosis, well, I heard from my siblings, what do I do? Is it safe? Not knowing what I know about how this affects me. Have I done enough work? And what happened was I re-engaged with her because I didn't want to never talk to her again. I didn't want her to have to go through that without any support from me at all. I didn't want to not be part of that process in some fashion. And what I found was because I had separated from her, now I could have appropriate boundaries. Now I could make decisions about how do I want to go about this? What are the topics that are on the table? And most important of all, I didn't expect things from her that she wasn't going to give me. I just didn't expect those things anymore. And so, I one time she was in the hospital and she told me some story about the nurses and stuff. And I just got off the phone and I just laughed. It's like, yep, that's my mom. It's just being narcissistic,
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't like, oh, this is hurting me, anymore. It was, and again, I could selectively be strategic about boundaries. How long am I going to talk to her? She sent me an email. Well, I'm not going to answer it today because I don't feel like it. I'm going to wait till I feel like it. Oh, 2 days later, how am I going to answer this? Well, she likes flowers, so I'll send her a picture of some flowers. I found ways to interact with her that didn't leave me feeling kind of raw and sort of rejected because that separation had happened. And so it's like, well, I'm not responsible. I'm sorry that she's sick and I don't want her to feel bad. And it hurt me that she was sick, but it was just like, but this is her life and I have my life and that's okay.
So you were able to establish boundaries between your mother and yourself.
Mm-hmm.
One of the other separations that seems to have been key here was that you were able to establish a separation between your mother and your expectations of your mother.
Yeah. Yeah. That's yeah. That was what made the boundaries possible. Because if you're enmeshed with another person, how the hell are you going to have any boundaries?
Almost sounds a little Buddhist that longing and expectations or hoping, longing is the source of all suffering.
It certainly is if you're longing for something that someone isn't capable of giving you or not willing to give you, or a combination of both.
Yeah.
And I think it's, I don't want other people to put expectations on me that I'm not capable of meeting. I don't want people to put obligations on me that I don't want to have. And so I don't want to do that to other people either. And I realized that even though I saw myself as the party who was being wronged with my mother, after I felt that separation, I realized it's like, man, it's just not ethical for me to keep putting these expectations on her that she is not going to meet. She's not capable of meeting. She might not even understand what they are. That's just not fair. That's not right. And so, sometimes when people challenge me on doing that work, the way that I did it, and even talking about it, like we're talking about it now, for me, it wasn't just about me. It was like everybody deserves to be who they are, regardless of who I think they should be. And so that was not a kind thing that I was doing by continuing to try to press her into being this sort of person who did the sort of things that I wanted. It was not unfair for me to have those needs. I mean, those needs and those desires were absolutely fair, but it was not fair for me to continue to sort of like keep her encapsulated in that.
That's really interesting. So it makes me want to ask you, and this will have to be our last question, although I hope we'll talk again,
Sure.
do another episode. It makes me wonder, how did your mother perceive you?
I don't think she was very happy. I don't, because we were both doing the same thing in the sense that she needed me to be a certain way and I wasn't doing it. And I needed her to be a certain way and she wasn't doing it.
What did she need you to be? How did she need you to behave?
She, for example, she did not want to acknowledge any of the work that I've done to since my late 20s to address the sort of deficiencies and the wounds and the developmental incompletions that I had myself, the way I went about it. I think that nobody in the family was happy that I wrote about these things and talked about my experience and so forth. And so she just basically pretended that none of that happened. So there was there's some big event at my high school, like about 10 or 15 years ago. And it's like some anniversary, like their 50th anniversary or something. And she told me that she wrote letters in to thank them for educating all of her children. And she put a little summary of what each of us had done. And my summary was computer programmer.
Wow.
So, and she, she didn't, and, bless her heart. It's like, I'm not trying to run anybody down here. Like I said, she's not a cartoon character. She's a person. My father's not a cartoon character. He's a person. Yeah. But, I couldn't really have a dialogue with her about problems I felt that we had in the relationship. I wanted to, but I think she was very unhappy that I just wouldn't let things go, because in her side of the family, that's what everybody did. You just you keep the peace. They had arguments, but they didn't really ever deal with anything. And then it's like, we're all buddy again and stuff. And so I think she liked me a lot better as a baby. And then the older I got, the more difficult it was for her, that because I think in some ways she saw me as an extension of herself. I think in some ways she saw me as I was kind of a wish fulfillment object. And when I wasn't behaving within the confines of the way that she had defined that for herself, I think that she wasn't happy with that.
All right, I got to ask you two more questions.
Okay.
You've got siblings. How did your siblings relate to your mother, and she to them? And you have 14 seconds. No, I'm sorry. No, you take all the time you need to give it a decent answer.
Well, I guess the best way I can put it is that there are 5 of us, and there are 2 teams. There's Team Dad and there's Team Mom. And 2 people are on Team Dad and 2 people are on Team Mom. And I am the non-aligned nation that basically doesn't have a home. So
wow,
that's kind of how it's broken up. Basically, people picked sides. My parents got divorced when I was, I guess, in my mid-20s. There are younger members of the family. There were a couple kids and a big gap, then some more kids, then a divorce. So it's almost like there are 2 families there. Same parents, but 2 different families because of the timing and the ages and all that kind of stuff. And so, I think I think this happens in a lot of these kind of situations where it's like you got to pick one parent, and the line is very hard, and I'm the one that's on the line because it's kind of like, well, this one was terrible, no, that one was terrible. It's like, well, I think they're both terrible, in various ways. And again, it's just like I could give you a long list of their good qualities too, but the balance was not in my favor as a child in terms of having the kind of parental context that would have enabled me to enter adulthood being my best. I did not enter adulthood at my best. I entered adulthood really, really broken in a lot of ways and just kind of barely functioning.
Well, that was before you started your self-study course at the School of Hard Knocks, right?
Correct. Yes. Yeah.
So the very last question would be, did your father ever have an occasion to know about and acknowledge the work you have done in your life other than be a computer programmer?
I made the very naive decision when the Iron Man book came out back in 1990 to send the press announcement, the marketing announcement for the book to each of them. And I've never heard anything from my father about it at all. My mother, I heard secondhand, was very unhappy about it. And so I don't know what my father knows about this part of my life, if anything.
Do you feel any desire or maybe a need for your own self, not necessarily altruistically, but for your own self to talk with him about that?
I won't say that I never have those feelings, but my experience with him has convinced me that that's a conversation that isn't really possible in any kind of functional way.
Okay.
And again, it's like, it's not just about what I want, it's about like, I want to respect who he is as a person. And I don't think he has the capacity to really have that conversation with me. Honestly, the best sort of conversations I've had with him were no conversation at all, where we just, I went back to the area where I grew up. We took a bike ride one day, and this was back in 1995, and we hardly talked. And that was like the best day I ever had with him. He's not so, and I recognize this about him now. And I think that was one of the sources of problems between us all along. It's just like, I need to be able to have deep conversations and all that kind of stuff. I was like that as a kid. I would drive him crazy. I'd go, why is the sky blue? He's like, oh God. Like, yeah, another one of these questions,
Yeah.
But,
yeah.
I just feel like I want to respect who he is. And he's quite old now. And I've challenged him in the past about his behavior and the state of our relationship and the things that I had problems with. And it just doesn't really, there's something that's not present there with him to have that conversation.
I got you. Okay, very good. Okay, so we're going to wrap it up with one final piece of information. I would suspect that there might be some men out there who have had the opportunity to hear you for, an hour more, and who are thinking, wow, that Rick Belden sounds like he's got his act pretty well together, and he holds himself out as a coach. And yeah, I'd like to play on his team. I'd like to have him teach me how to play the game he's learned how to play. Is it rickbelden.com? How do people find you?
I had a couple of different websites. My coaching website is rickbeldencoaching.com. So if you're interested in what I offer as a coach, just within that point of view, you can go to rickbeldencoaching.com. I also have rickbelden.com, which is kind of my master website. And that has access to my YouTube channel. It has access to podcasts. It has access to articles, poetry from my poetry books, some of my artwork. So either one of those is a good entry point. rickbeldencoaching.com is specifically if you're like, hey, I think I might like to find out about this guy, what he offers as a coach and what it'd be like to work with him. That's the place to go.
Very good. Rick Belden, thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure to talk with you. You're a wonderful man. Thank you.
Well, thanks.
You're a wonderful and a strong and a beautiful man. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to have the opportunity to talk to you at last.
Terrific. Thank you. I hope we do it again.
I hope so too.
Thank you, Rick. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to Men Are Talking. Did we deliver? Did you hear something that made you think, wow, I never thought of it like that? Let us know. If we did, tell your friends.